The courthouse door swung open hard enough to crack against the limestone wall, and every head in Caldwell County turned to watch the girl walk in. She was not what they expected. She wore her dead mother's boots, black calfskin, resoled twice, the left heel worn down at an angle that told you something about how the woman who'd owned them had carried her grief. The girl's name was Nora Voss, and she was 23 years old. And she walked to the front of that courtroom the way a person walks into a burning barn to save something worth saving, not reckless, but resolved in a way that precluded turning back. The Honorable Judge Archibald Steen sat elevated behind his bench like a man who had confused height with authority for so long he'd stopped noticing the difference. He had jowls that shook when he laughed and small eyes the color of creek water gone stagnant. He looked at Nora Voss the way men like him always looked at women who had no business being in their rooms, with a contempt so comfortable it had become architectural, built into every wall of his expression. The courtroom smelled of tobacco spit and old paper and the particular sourness of men who'd been sweating since morning in rooms that didn't breathe. Nora set her leather satchel on the table. Inside it were 3 letters, 2 land deeds, a surveyor's map from 1871, and a handwritten testimony from a woman who had died 6 weeks ago without seeing justice done. Her mother. Judge Steen leaned forward, and the bench creaked under him like it resented the weight. "Girl," he said, and he let the word sit there, ugly as a thrown stone, "you couldn't win this case if God Almighty was your co-counsel." He smiled then, wide and wet. "But I'll tell you what, you win it, I'll resign this bench. Right here. Right now." He spread his hands. "How's that for sport?" The laughter in the room rose and broke like a small wave. Nora Voss did not smile. She looked at him the way the land looks at a drought, patient, enduring, and absolutely certain that rain would eventually come. "Then get comfortable, Judge," she said. "This won't take long. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. But to understand what happened in that courtroom, you have to go back 6 weeks. To the morning Nora Voss arrived at the Harlan Reach with 2 children who were not hers and a mule that was barely anyone's. The Reach was what folks called the property, 43 acres of hard-won grassland and cedar breaks that sat along the elbow of the Palo Duro Draw, southwest of the town of Delridge. It had belonged to Edmund Harlan for 20 years before he died of a fever that took him in 4 days flat, leaving behind a wife, 2 children, a half-finished barn roof, and a debt to a man named Cutter Wells that nobody in Delridge talked about openly but everyone knew about quietly. Nora's mother, Clara Voss, had been Edmund's nearest neighbor and oldest friend. When Edmund died, Clara had ridden over to the Reach twice a week to help his widow, May, keep the place standing. And when May's lungs started filling with something dark and wet in February, it was Clara who stayed, who slept in the spare room, who boiled poultices and read aloud from Psalms and held May's hand through the long cold nights. May died on a Tuesday. Clara died on a Friday, 3 weeks later, from the same thing, grief or sickness or the combination of the two that the frontier sometimes delivered without distinction. Which left Nora and Thomas, who was 11, with Edmund's serious brown eyes and a habit of watching the sky for weather, and little June, who was 7 and hadn't spoken a full sentence since her mother passed, but who carried a cornhusk doll she'd named Margaret with a ferocity that dared the world to comment on it. They arrived at the Reach on a grey Thursday morning, the mule shoes clicking on the frozen draw path, the children bundled in quilts on the wagon board beside Nora. The wind came off the caprock with a meanness particular to early March, not cold enough to freeze your breath but cold enough to make you understand the land did not especially welcome you. The house was in the condition that happens to places when the person who loved them most is gone. The front step had heaved and cracked from winter frost. Someone, Thomas, Nora guessed, had propped a split log under the porch rail to keep it from falling, and the improvised repair was so earnest and so insufficient that it nearly broke her. A tin bucket had been left outside and was half full of black rainwater. The kitchen window on the south side was patched with oilcloth where the glass had broken, and the oilcloth snapped and breathed with each gust like a sick lung. Nora unhitched the mule and led her to the lean-to. She checked the water trough, empty and crusted, and filled it from the draw pump, working the handle until her shoulder ached. The mule drank without gratitude, which was fine. Nora didn't need gratitude from the mule. Inside, the children stood in the middle of the main room and looked at the cold stove and the unwashed bowls on the table and the dust that had settled on everything like a second grief. June held Margaret tighter. Thomas looked at Nora with eyes too old for his face. "Mama always swept Thursday mornings," he said. "Then we'll sweep Thursday mornings," Nora said. She found the broom behind the door where brooms always are and handed it to Thomas. Not because she needed him to sweep, but because she understood that a boy who has lost his mother and his father needs something to do with his hands before his mind starts doing terrible things on its own. She built a fire in the stove with cedar kindling from the box beside the hearth, and it caught slow and smoky before it caught clean. She put water on. She found, in the root cellar off the kitchen, steep earthen steps, the smell of cold clay and dried herbs, half a sack of cornmeal, 3 withered onions, a crock of lard, 4 strips of salt pork wrapped in cloth, and a small tin of dried red pepper. She found 2 eggs in the straw box near the back, miraculously unbroken. She made cornbread first, mixing the meal with a pinch of salt and the lard and the eggs and enough warm water to bring it together, pressing it into the black iron skillet and setting it in the oven. Then she cut the salt pork thin and rendered it in the spider pan until the fat ran clear and the edges crisped. She diced the onions, her eyes watering, though not only from the onions, and softened them in the drippings until they went translucent and sweet. She added cornmeal to thicken, and the dried pepper for warmth. And enough water to make a kind of porridge that wouldn't win prizes but would stick to ribs and tell the body it was being looked after. Thomas had swept the main room and was now, without being asked, washing the dirty bowls in the basin, scrubbing with a rag and cold water. His jaw set with the particular determination of a child trying to be useful because usefulness is the only language left for love. June had settled herself on the hearth rug near the stove with Margaret in her lap, watching the fire through the cracked oven door with those enormous, unspeaking eyes. When the cornbread came out, golden on top, darker at the edges, smelling of something warm and fundamental, June looked up at Nora with an expression that was not quite a question and not quite a thank you, but lived somewhere in between. They sat at the table, the 3 of them. Nora set the bowls down, cut the cornbread into thirds, and sat across from the children. Outside, the wind pressed against the oilcloth window patch and sighed like something enormous and tired. Thomas picked up his spoon. "Set it down," said, quietly. "Mama used to say grace." "Then say it," Nora told him. And he did, short, careful words that a boy says when he's talking to God but also talking to the air where his mother used to be. June folded her small hands around Margaret's cloth ones and bowed her head. When Thomas said Amen, June reached across the table and put 1 finger on the back of Nora's hand. 1 finger. Barely a touch. And then she pulled it back and picked up her spoon. Nora looked at the wall and breathed very carefully for a moment. They ate. Outside, the cedar brakes rattled in the wind. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. Somewhere past the drawer, a coyote gave 1 flat, ascending cry and was answered by nothing. The house was not warm yet. But it was warmer than it had been. The first 2 weeks at the Reach moved the way frontier weeks do, slow in individual hours and startlingly fast in retrospect, measured not in days but in things accomplished and things endured. Nora fixed the porch step with a proper cedar plank and 2 penny nails she found in a coffee tin in the barn. She replaced the oilcloth window patch with a pane of real glass she'd brought wrapped in flour sacking. And when Thomas held the frame steady while she set the glazing compound, his hand small and precise and entirely serious, she understood he was not just helping her fix a window. He was fixing something else. Something interior and harder to name. She taught him the burn pile, which brush to take from the cedar brakes and which to leave, how to read wind before you lit, how to watch a fire and not let your mind wander to other things. He was a quick student, methodical and careful, and she told him so plainly. Because children who have suffered loss often stop being told the true things and start only being told the comforting ones, and Nora believed that plain truth, delivered with steadiness, was its own kind of comfort. June remained quieter. But she began to follow Nora at a distance, not close, not underfoot, but present. When Nora went to feed the chickens that May had kept penned behind the barn, June came along and stood at the fence and watched with those grave eyes. On the 5th morning, without comment, June lifted the latch herself, went in, and scattered the grain with a practiced, proprietary arm. She knew the chickens. They were hers. She had simply needed to remember it. The day June laughed for the first time was a Tuesday, and it was because the mule, a large, philosophical creature Nora had named Principal, stepped into the empty water trough while Nora was filling it from the opposite end, looked at the situation with profound indignation, and refused to step out. June watched from the fence, and the laugh that came out of her was small and sudden and surprised, as if it had escaped before she could catch it. She looked briefly alarmed at herself, and then looked at Nora, and Nora said, very seriously, "She does that," and June's face cracked open like spring ground and she laughed again, longer this time. It was, Nora thought, the sound of a window opening in a room that had been shut all winter. What Nora did not share with the children, what she carried alone. The way women on the frontier learned to carry the things that would crush the smaller and younger ones around them, was the document she'd found tucked inside her mother's Bible on the night Clara died. It was a promissory note, signed by Edmund Harlan in 1874, for the sum of $800 borrowed from one Cutter Wells of Delridge, Texas. The note bore an interest clause written in the cramped, deliberate hand of a man who understood that the clause, not the principal, was where the real money lived. And beside the note was a letter, in her mother's handwriting, describing what Clara had discovered in May's final weeks, that Cutter Wells had presented May with a revised accounting that inflated the debt to nearly $2,000 through manufactured interest and false fees, and had threatened to seize the reach and everything on it if payment was not received within 90 days of Edmund's death. Edmund had been dead for 5 months. The 90 days were long past. 40 miles east, in the river town of Mesquite Crossing where the courthouse sat above a barber shop and the smell of bay rum drifted up through the floorboards on warm days, Cutter Wells sat in a chair in his office above the stockyard and read a telegram. He was not a large man. Men who take things from other people rarely need to be here. They learn early that the paperwork does more damage than the fist. Wells had a fastidious quality to him, neat clothes and clean nails and a voice that never rose above a gentlemanly register, which made him, in the estimation of people who dealt with him, considerably more frightening than a man who shouted. The telegram was from his man in Delridge, a part-time county clerk named Fitch who kept Wells informed of relevant local developments in exchange for the kind of consideration that never appeared on any ledger. Young woman at Harlan Property, Fitch had written. Voss girl. Clara Voss's daughter. Asking questions at the land office. Wells set the telegram on his desk and looked at the window. The river was high from snowmelt, brown and muscular, pushing south. He had been patient with the Harlan situation because patience was profitable. But the Voss girl asking questions at the land office meant she'd found something, and what she'd found, if handled wrong, could become inconvenient. He called in the man who waited in his outer office, a lean, sun-damaged individual named Cord who did the kinds of work that didn't appear in polite conversation, and gave him instructions that were brief and left considerable room for interpretation. Go out to the reach, Wells said. Have a look. Don't be seen. Cord nodded once and put on his hat and left. Wells went back to his telegram. Outside, the river moved on, indifferent, carrying whatever the land had given it. The town of Delridge sat on a limestone bench above a seasonal creek, 7 buildings wide and 4 deep, with ambitions that the land had mostly declined to honor. There was a dry goods store run by a woman named Ida Partridge who knew everything that passed through the county and shared most of it freely. There was a livery, a post office in the front room of a private house, a one-room school that operated 8 months of the year, and the courthouse, a 2-story limestone block that served Caldwell County in all its judicial and administrative functions, and that was, in the words of Judge Archibald Steen, the center of civilized life for 50 miles in any direction. Nora rode into Delridge on the first clear Saturday in 3 weeks, leaving Thomas in charge of the Reach with a list of morning chores and instructions to bolt the door at midday. She brought June on the seat beside her, because June had begun to untangle from her silence and Nora believed the untangling needed tending with fresh air and different scenery. At the dry goods store, Ida Partridge watched Nora move through the shelves with the quality of attention she brought to matters of genuine interest. "You're the Voss girl," Ida said. It was not a question. "Yes, Staying out at the Harlan place." "For the time being." Ida let a measured pause hang in the air between them like smoke. "People are talking," she said, and in her voice was the tone of a woman who is reporting news she is not herself responsible for generating, which was not precisely accurate. Nora set a spool of thread on the counter. "People generally are. Unmarried woman. 2 children that aren't her own. Out on a property under debt dispute." Ida ticked the items off as if reading from a ledger. "You can see how it looks." "I can see how some might choose to make it look," Nora said, which was a distinction Ida apparently chose not to engage with. The bell over the door rang, and Nora turned to find Judge Steen filling the frame, not with his physical size, which was ordinary enough, but with the weight of his office, which he wore the way some men wore expensive coats, conspicuously and at all temperatures. He looked at June first, at the corn-husk doll tucked under her arm, and then at Nora, and the ordering of that look said something about how he arranged his world. "Miss Voss," he said. "Good of you to show your face in town." "Good morning, Judge." He moved to the counter, unhurried. He picked up a twist of tobacco and set a coin down for it, a transaction that served primarily to give his hand something to do while he spoke. "I understand you're occupying the Harlan property." "Managing it," Nora said. "On behalf of the Harlan children." He turned the tobacco in his fingers. "And under what legal authority might that be?" "Their mother asked me to." "Orally, I imagine." "A verbal request from a woman who has since died." He let that sit. "Not what the law would call a binding instrument." "Clara Voss kept a written record," Nora said. "In her Bible." Steen's expression shifted slightly, a tightening around the eyes, too brief and too controlled. "It told her something she filed away." "A Bible entry," he said, "is not a guardianship deed." "No," Nora agreed. "It is not. I'll be filing the proper paperwork Monday morning at the land office." "The land office." He smiled then, the wet, wide smile she would come to know well. "You understand that the property itself is the subject of a debt claim, filed by a creditor of the Harlan estate. Before you file any paperwork." Around them, the store had gone very quiet. Ida Partridge was reorganizing a shelf of tinned goods with the intensity of a woman trying to hear better. June, who had been examining a jar of horehound candy on the low shelf, came and stood beside Nora. She didn't take Nora's hand. She simply stood close, Margaret pressed against her chest, and looked at the judge with 7-year-old directness that was somehow more confrontational than anything an adult might have managed. Steen looked down at the girl, and whatever he saw there made him return his attention to Nora with slightly less ease than he'd had before. "The debt claim has discrepancies," Nora said. "Claims often do. That's what courts are for." "Then I'll see you in court," Nora said simply. She paid for her thread, her salt, her small bag of coffee, and walked June out into the March sunlight, which had come out hard and bright off the limestone storefronts and made everything look cleaner than it was. On the wagon board, June tugged her sleeve. "What does discrepancies mean?" she asked. It was the longest sentence she'd spoken in 6 weeks. Nora felt it land in her chest like something she'd been holding her breath for. "It means the numbers were wrong on purpose," Nora said. June considered this with the gravity she brought to all things. "Is that bad?" "For the man who wrote them," Nora said. "Yes." That evening, after supper, Nora sat at the kitchen table with Clara's Bible and the promissory note and a surveyor's map spread out under the lamp. She had been to the land office twice before this, before the judge had said what he said in the dry goods store, and what she'd found there had sat quiet in her like a coal waiting for air. The original Harlan deed, recorded in 1866, described the reach's eastern boundary by reference to a cedar post set at the fork of the draw. The surveyor's map she'd pulled from her mother's satchel, drawn by a federally licensed surveyor in 1871. Initialed and dated on every corner, placed that cedar post 40 yards east of where Cutter Wells's deed claim assumed it to be. 40 yards. Enough to exclude the best acre of the eastern pasture, the acre that sat above the aquifer. The one that made the reach worth what it was worth rather than what the surrounding hardscrabble was worth. The acre without which any reasonable creditor would consider the collateral insufficient to justify the loan amount as claimed. In other words, the debt, as presented, was secured against land the Harlans had never officially owned in Wells's interpretation, and the loan amount was calculated against a property value inflated by including land that belonged, by the original deed, to no one in dispute. It was not simple. It would not be easy. But it was there, solid and documentary, the way truth usually is when it survives, quietly, in the margins of things, waiting for someone patient enough to read it. The man came on a Wednesday night, 3 days after Nora's visit to town. She heard him before she saw anything, not a sound exactly, more the absence of the right sounds. The nightbirds had gone quiet in the cedar breaks east of the barn, and the mule, Principal, had shifted in her lean-to and made a single low sound that was not complaint but attention. Nora had slept light since arriving at the reach. The frontier schooled you in that, if nothing else, the particular alertness that lives just below sleep, that lifts you at the wrong sound the way a trout lifts at a shadow on the water. She was out of her bunk and into her boots and had the Winchester off the wall hooks before she was fully conscious of the sequence. She checked the children's room, both breathing, Thomas curled with his back to the wall the way boys do when they've learned the world is sometimes hazardous. June with Margaret tucked under her chin. Nora pulled their door quietly closed and moved through the dark kitchen to the back window. The moon was 3/4, white and cold, and it silvered the barn roof and the fence posts and the draw path that curved away into the cedar breaks. She could see clearly enough to know the yard was empty. She waited. 3 minutes. 4. Principal shifted again. Then she saw him, the lean shape of a man moving from the shadow of the barn toward the lean-to, moving carefully, pausing between each step the way a man moves who is trying to be somewhere without being there. He was checking the mule, she understood. He was checking whether she was home and whether she was alone. Nora opened the back door. Just opened it, let the cold air in, let the hinge give it small, plain sound. Stood in the doorway with the Winchester at her side, not raised, just there. The man by the lean-to froze. She said, at normal volume, conversational, I see you. Nothing moved. The cedar breaks moved, the shadow of them moving across the grass. I want you to know, she continued, that I can see you, and I want you to go back and tell whoever sent you that I've seen you. That's the message. You carry it and you leave, and we don't do this differently. A long pause. The nightbirds were still silent. Somewhere far off, the draw murmured. The man stepped backward. One step, then another, then he turned and went into the cedar breaks with the kind of speed that abandons the pretense of caution. She heard him for a while, the branches, the dry grass, and then she heard nothing. Nora stood in the doorway for a long time with the cold coming in around her. She thought about what fear feels like when you are responsible for something beyond yourself. It is different from ordinary fear, she had discovered. Ordinary fear is for yourself and lives in your stomach. This kind lived in your chest, near your heart, and it was heavier and colder and also, in its way, clarifying. It told you exactly what mattered and what didn't, with a precision that ordinary days couldn't manage. She thought about her mother, who had come to this same property twice a week in the winter cold because a friend needed help, and had stayed until that friend died, and had then died herself. And had left behind in her Bible the thing that would, set this right. She thought about Thomas, who swept Thursday mornings because his mother had. About June, who laughed at a mule. She thought about Judge Steen's wet, wide smile and the absolute certainty in it. The comfort he took from knowing the world was arranged to his benefit and that there was no instrument in it likely to disturb that arrangement. She thought about the cedar post 40 yards east. When she finally came back inside, she did not go back to bed. She sat at the kitchen table in the dark and laid the Winchester across her knees and listened to the house breathe around her, the tick of the cooling stove, the creak of settling timbers. The small night sounds of 2 children sleeping in the next room, and she made a decision the way you make the only decision available to you when you've seen the full shape of a thing clearly. She would go to the courthouse. She would bring the surveyor's map and the promissory note and the letters her mother had written in careful, clear script. And she would stand in front of Archibald Steen and his wet smile and his comfortable contempt, and she would make him see the cedar post. Not because she believed in his court. Not because she believed in him. But because the law, used correctly, was a lever, and a lever properly placed could move things that brute force could not. And Nora Voss had grown up watching the world push women to the margins until women learned to find levers and use them and push back. In the morning she told Thomas they were going into Mesquite Crossing. He looked at her with those old eyes. For the court thing? Yes. He nodded, slow and deliberate, as if he'd been expecting it. Okay, he said. And then, carefully, are you going to win? Nora considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I'm going to show them what's true, she said. The winning is what happens after. The Caldwell County Courthouse was standing room only on the first morning of the Harlan debt hearing. Which surprised no one who understood how a small county entertains itself in the last cold weeks of winter. Cutter Wells sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney. A man from Abilene named Greer who wore a suit that fit too well for the room and carried a leather case of papers with the confidence of a man who had never lost anything in a courthouse and attributed this to merit rather than circumstance. Nora sat alone at the defendant's table. She had no attorney. She had, instead, her mother's Bible, a surveyor's map, 3 letters, and a promissory note, arranged before her in the precise order she intended to use them. She wore her mother's black calfskin boots. She had thought about that choice and made it deliberately. Thomas and June sat in the first row of the gallery behind her, Thomas with his hands folded in his lap and his jaw set. June with Margaret pressed against her sternum and her enormous eyes watching everything. Beside them sat the school teacher, a steady woman named Mrs. Grover, who had driven 15 miles to be present and who had told Nora the night before, when she arrived at the Reach to take the children, that she had known Clara Voss and that Clara Voss had been the finest person Caldwell County had produced and that if there was anything Mrs. Grover could do, she intended to do it. There were others in that gallery. Ida Partridge, who had the grace to look slightly ashamed of herself. The land office clerk, a young man named Abner who had been helpful and nervous in equal measure when Nora had come to pull the original deed. 2 cattlemen from the south end of the county who had their own reasons for watching what Wells did with a debt claim and a piece of land. And others, men and women who had come the way people come to things they don't fully understand but sense matter, pulled by the gravity of it. Judge Steen arranged himself behind his bench. He looked at Nora and produced a smaller version of his smile, more private, the kind a man keeps for situations he considers already resolved. We're here on the matter of Wells versus the Harlan estate, he said. Mr. Greer, you may present the claim. Greer stood and made his presentation, smooth, well-organized. Built on the promissory note and a set of accounts he had prepared that showed the debt compounding to $1,940, plus court costs. He produced witnesses, a Delridge banker who confirmed Wells had extended the loan in good faith, and the county clerk, Fitch, who appeared briefly and with visible discomfort. Nora listened and did not write anything down. She did not need to. When Greer concluded, Judge Steen turned to her. Miss Voss, as you've chosen to represent yourself in this matter, I'll remind you that the court expects orderly, Your Honor, Nora said, standing. I'd like to enter 3 documents into evidence. Steen paused. You may. She handed the bailiff the promissory note, the original, not Wells's copy, and the surveyor's map, and the first of Clara's letters. The bailiff carried them to the bench. Steen looked at them with the deliberate incuriosity of a man performing a formality. The original promissory note, Nora said, shows a principal of $800 at 6% annual interest, standard terms. Over the period of the loan, the correctly calculated interest brings the debt to $912. Not $1,940. Interest calculations can be complex, Greer said from his table. They can, Nora agreed, pleasantly. This is why I brought the note that Mr. Wells himself signed. She paused. The one he apparently forgot to include in his own filings. Something moved in the room. A shift, like weight redistributing. The land office, Nora continued, holds the original Harlan property deed from 1866. I have also filed, as of Monday, the federally licensed survey conducted in 1871 by one Marcus Dodd of the U.S. General Land Office. She moved to the surveyor's map, spread it on the clerk's table, and indicated the eastern boundary with one steady finger. The cedar postmarker at the draw fork. This survey places the Harlan eastern boundary 40 yards east of where Mr. Wells's valuation assumes it to be. Greer was on his feet. The survey is federally licensed and recorded, Nora said. The original, which supersedes any local valuation. She looked at the bench. Which means the property, valued correctly against its legal boundaries, was insufficient collateral for the loan amount as claimed. Which means the loan, as extended, contained terms the collateral could not legally support. Which means the debt claim, as filed, is built on a valuation that does not correspond to the deeded property. The room had gone very still. Judge Steen sat with the surveyor's map before him and the expression of a man who has stepped onto what he believed was solid ground and felt it give beneath him, not collapse, just give. Just that first terrible inch. Furthermore, Nora said, and she lifted the third document, her mother's last letter, written in the careful, diminishing script of a woman fighting illness for the clarity of mind to leave something behind. My mother recorded a conversation with May Harlan in which Mr. Wells explicitly stated that the eastern boundary discrepancy was known to him at the time of the loan's extension, and that the inflated valuation was intentional. She set the letter on the clerk's table. This constitutes evidence of fraudulent inducement. The silence lasted long enough to have texture. Then, from the gallery, one of the cattlemen said, low and level, Lord Almighty. Greer leaned to Wells and murmured. Wells sat very still with his clean nails on the table and his face arranged in the neutral expression of a man computing rapidly. Steen looked at the documents. Looked at Nora. Looked at the gallery, which was looking at him. Your Honor, Nora said, I move that the debt claim be dismissed, the Harlan property deed be affirmed in its original boundaries, and that the court note the evidentiary question surrounding the loan's original terms for any appropriate further inquiry. Greer said, Your Honor. We'd request a recess. You'll have no recess, said one of the cattlemen from the gallery, standing now, his hat in his hand. Arlie Foss, Your Honor, South County. I got a similar note from this same man and I want to know what the court intends to do. Another man stood. And then a woman, Ida Partridge, who had the expression of someone performing a long overdue correction. Steen raised his gavel. He looked at the room, the standing people, the documents on his clerk's table. The young woman in the black calfskin boots who had not moved from her position in front of the defendant's table and whose expression was not triumphant but simply steady. Simply waiting, and something in his face underwent a complicated, private process, like ice deciding whether to hold or crack. He set the gavel down without striking. The debt claim, he said, slowly, as if reading something he hadn't written, is dismissed. He cleared his throat. The original deed boundaries of the Harlan property are affirmed as recorded and surveyed. He looked at Greer, then at Wells. The court will additionally refer the matter of loan origination practices to the Territorial Attorney's Office for review. A sound went through the gallery, not celebration exactly, more release. The sound of a room that had been holding its breath letting it go. Nora gathered her documents one at a time, careful and unhurried. Steen looked at her across the courtroom. She met his eyes and waited. He had the grace, the only grace she would ever grant him, to look away first. He did not resign. She had not expected him to. Men like Steen never did the thing they promised when they were certain they'd never be required to do it. But the room had heard him say it, and the room would remember, and in a county where a man's word was the only currency that didn't inflate, that was its own species of consequence. His bench would feel different under him after this. The weight of it would change. Wells was gone from the courthouse before she reached the door. His attorney followed 2 minutes later, the leather case tucked under his arm, moving with the specifically purposeful stride of a man who wants to be somewhere else entirely. She heard later, Ida Partridge saw to the circulation of accurate information with the same efficiency she'd previously applied to less accurate information, that Wells had creditors of his own. And that the territorial attorney's inquiry, once opened, found sufficient material to keep it open for some considerable time. In the years that followed, she heard Wells's name less and then not at all. The frontier was like that with men who operated in margins. Eventually, the margins closed. Outside the courthouse, in the cold March light that had come out sharp and yellow off the limestone, Thomas was waiting on the steps. He had both hands in his coat pockets and his chin up, watching her come through the door. She stopped in front of him. He said, "Did you?" "We did," she said. He made a sound in the back of his throat and looked away at the middle distance with wet eyes and the determined jaw of a boy refusing, heroically, to cry in public. Then June was beside him and she reached up and put her arms around Nora's waist and held on with the iron grip of a 7-year-old who has decided something irrevocably. Nora looked up at the courthouse facade, the limestone block, the date cut above the door, 1871, and thought about her mother, who would have stood right here if she had lived. With this same feeling in her chest. This complicated, aching fullness that was part grief and part relief and part something else, something harder to name, the feeling of having carried a thing all the way to where it needed to go. Mrs. Grover had the wagon ready at the hitching post. She looked at Nora with the expression of a woman who requires no explanation. "You'll come for supper," she said. It was not an invitation. "Yes, Nora said. They drove back toward the reach in the long western light, the four of them, the mule patient on the road home. June fell asleep against Nora's arm before they'd gone 5 miles, Margaret tucked under her chin. Thomas watched the landscape go by with those serious eyes, the cedar breaks and the yellow grass and the sky going colors above the caprock that no painter ever quite managed to get right. At some point Thomas said, without turning from the window, "Are we going to be all right?" Nora looked at the road. At the reach in the distance, the barn roof catching the last light, the fence posts casting long shadows east. "Yes," she said. A pause. "How do you know?" She thought of her mother's handwriting in a Bible. The weight of a child's finger on the back of her hand. The sound of a girl laughing at a mule. The 40 yards that made everything possible. Because the truth was always there, she said. We just had to be the ones to stay long enough to read it. Thomas nodded, slow and deliberate, the way he did when he was adding something to the inventory of things he intended to keep. The wagon rolled on. The caprock flashed red in the dying light and then went purple and then grey, and the first star appeared in the east over the draw, hard and cold and absolute. They were home before dark. There is a particular kind of strength that the frontier was always producing without ever naming it, the strength that belongs to people who are given nothing. Who are told they have no standing and no instrument and no recourse, and who go looking anyway, in Bibles and land office drawers and surveyors' maps. For the truth that has been quietly waiting to be found. Nora Voss did not set out to be remarkable. She set out to keep a promise, her mother's implicit one, the kind that doesn't require words. The kind that lives in showing up and staying and doing the next necessary thing until the necessary things are done. What she found, in the doing, was this, that broken places are not the end of a story. A cracked porch step can be replanted in cedar. A window patched in oilcloth can hold rail glass. A child gone silent can find, in the presence of a steadfast person and an indignant mule, her way back to laughter. And a courtroom arranged against you, or a man behind a bench, and a sneer and a certainty as old as the hills, can be unmade by 40 yards, by a dead woman's careful handwriting. By a daughter who wore her mother's boots and carried her mother's truth all the way to the place where it needed to be heard. The land doesn't give or withhold its lessons based on who you are. It only asks, are you paying attention? Nora Voss was paying attention. She had learned it from the best. The Reach stood for another 60 years. Thomas Harlan became a surveyor. June Harlan became a lawyer. And on a shelf in the Harlan house, beside a worn leather Bible, there sat a cornhusk doll named Margaret, who had witnessed all of it and held her peace.